Thank you, Tom. The next speaker will be Ambassador Daniel Kretzer, currently a lecturer at the S. Daniel Abraham Center at Princeton University and the former ambassador in Israel, twice I think, no? Once on, twice it was Indy, yeah. Once, and in Egypt. Please, Dan.
Good morning. I too want to thank Amos and Ephraim and Shlomo and many friends in the audience for the opportunity to join you today at this conference. I want to spend 14 of my 15 minutes looking ahead, which is what the title of the conference has asked us to do. But I do want to spend 1 minute looking back, as Uzi Arad did, with the curiosity of why would one use a counterfactual approach to history when there's enough serious history to be debated. In fact, I would have urged Uzi, if he was going to do a counterfactual approach, to actually start his analysis in 1991 or 92, when Yitzhak Rabin HaManoach spoke publicly, and then when he became prime minister, spoke privately with then President George H.W. Bush about Israel's long-term existential threats, which he defined as coming from Iran. And to resolve Israel's long-term existential threats, Rabin said it was imperative to reach a comprehensive solution of the Arab-Israeli conflict. So if you want to do a counterfactual history, I would suggest we also look at that, and that may be the subject of another conference in which we can hear from Uzi and others on that question of what would have happened had, in fact, the promise of the 1990s and the peace process been fulfilled. I've been asked to look at U.S.-Israeli relations going forward, and there are at least 4 or 5 prisms through which to analyze this. One way might be to start with Dickens. It's the best of times and in some ways the worst of times. Hopefully we have passed through those worst of times. And in fact, the 3 of us, before coming to Israel, had a chance last week to meet with some very senior officials in Washington who made it clear that from the perspective of the American administration, what was. Masha haya, haya. And we are now looking forward to deal with the challenges and to deal with the problems, understanding that not all of the issues of the past have been resolved, but ready, in a sense, to close the file on the history of the past period and to try to build a better relationship on the core issues. And in fact, from what we understand, Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit in Washington seemed to accomplish the same purpose. The Prime Minister came away from his meetings and said publicly that these were among the best meetings he had had, and the suggestion was that he was also looking forward. If we're going to do that, though, it's probably wise to examine 4 or 5 perspectives through which our relations are governed, and to see whether or not we can actually do a better job the next time around than we were able to do over the past few years in managing this very rich and complicated relationship between our 2 countries. On the one hand, the good times, the best of all worlds, is the fact that even during this period of stress and strain, assistance levels from the United States, as you know, especially in the area of security assistance, have gone up exponentially. And that the United States' commitment to Israel's security, to its qualitative military edge, the QME, has not waned at all. And in fact, today, a delegation will be arriving in Israel to talk about the next manifestation of that relationship. In other words, to come up with a formula for dealing with the next 10 years of security assistance to help Israel deal with its concerns and security threats. Our intelligence and strategic cooperation have remained firm throughout this period, and we expect that that would continue. And our technology cooperation has been unprecedented. Just one example, as you know better than we in the United States, is the cooperation that was manifested in the production of Iron Dome. But we do know that relations between individual leaders have been toxic at times. And we also know that it hasn't been helped by what people have said publicly about each other, what Israeli leaders have said about American leaders, what American leaders have said about Israeli leaders, what journalists have written, what some former ambassadors have written, have not helped the situation at all. So as we look forward, let me suggest 4 or 5 prisms through which to analyze how we can actually do better. The first may have been suggested by 2 well-known personalities on a panel at the recent General Assembly of the Jewish Federations of North America. Peter Beinart and Chemi Shalev, a writer for Haaretz, were on a panel. I think the panel was named something to the effect, Israelis are from Mars and Americans are from Venus. The suggestion being that Israelis tend to see the solution to the problems that they face through the use of force and through the employment of their military, whereas Americans are softer in their approach, as Venus is softer than Mars, and are less prone to use military force to solve problems. It's a curious comparison given the fact that over the last 15 years, more than 150,000 American troops have been almost constantly stationed in this region dealing with threats not only to the United States but region-wide. It's also curious because if you go back about 10 or 12 years, there was a book authored by a prominent neoconservative, Robert Kagan, which was entitled, Americans Are From Mars and Europeans Are From Venus. So it's apparently convenient if you don't like the policy of the other side, you resort to the name-calling of comparing the other side to Venus, as though it's somehow wrong to try to solve problems without the resort to military force. And this suggests that one of the areas then for us to talk about in the future is the degree to which diplomacy is actually an asset of power, an asset of Israeli power and an asset of American power. It is not a manifestation of weakness at all. It does not preclude the use of force to resolve a problem, but diplomacy, in fact, is designed to avoid the use of force by trying to resolve problems through the give and take of discussions and negotiations. A second prism through which to analyze our relationship as we go ahead is, of course, the prism of national interest, self-interest. And the reality is, although we don't normally talk about it, is that the United States and Israel for a number of years do not share the same interests when it comes to significant aspects of our respective foreign policies. That's in some ways to be expected. The United States still is the strongest military and economic power in the world. We are a global power, both Atlantic and Pacific. Israel is a very strong state, both economically and militarily, but it's a regional power, and therefore our perspective on international issues is bound to be different. But it's also led to some very significant specific differences which we need to talk about. For example, when Russia acted in Ukraine and basically annexed Crimea, Israel absented itself, as you know, from a United Nations vote on this issue, rather than cross its relations with Russia. When the United States announced about a year ago the restoration of diplomatic relations with Cuba, Israel was silent for reasons that Israel probably assumed would help its relations with various political parties in the United States. Israel's relations with China are different from those of the United States, neither better nor worse, but the United States has a perspective of building a relationship with China that takes into account China's rising economic and military power in Asia, a region of tremendous security and political concern to the United States, and Israel has its own interests, be they economic, trade, or technology transfer. So you have a situation in which our two countries naturally, and without blame to be assessed on one or the other for having a different set of interests, do not share the same set of national self-interest when it comes to these core issues. And that's not fatal. But it does call for much more intense discussions at the top and also at the bureaucratic level to see how we can minimize friction on these issues as they arise. A third prism to look at is the issue of personalities and relationships among leaders. What some have called the toxic relationship between the United States President and the Israeli Prime Minister is really not new. One can look back at the period of Begin and Carter, or Shamir and George H.W. Bush. We've had periods of our bilateral relations when the leaders didn't get along, didn't trust each other very much, and tended to see the worst possible motives from the other side. And so it's not really an issue of whether or not one is to blame or the other is to blame. The question is, how do you deal in a situation in which the two leaders do not get along? And I think we have to be honest in saying that these two leaders have not found a way over the past 7 years to build the kind of relationship of mutual trust that we all would have preferred. So it's not a question of denying a reality, but rather how to deal with it. And that's another argument for more intensive consultations. Finally, I would look at this relationship through the prism of us, the public, both Israeli and American publics. Because even in the darkest moments of our bilateral relations, and we saw some of these moments during the course of the Iran debate, both publics, the United States public and the Israeli public, did not want to see a substantial change in the close relationship between our two countries and two peoples. We like each other. We tend to trust each other. We tend to feel each other's pain when there are problems here with respect to terrorism, when there are problems in the United States with respect to gun violence or other kinds of issues. Our two publics have found a way over the course of the past almost 70 years to develop a people-to-people relationship that really is unparalleled in the world. And so that is also a prism that should be used by our policymakers to exploit our relationship for the better in the period ahead. If I were to sum up the past couple of minutes of reflection in one word, I would use the word trust. We have to find a way both to restore the trust that used to exist in our bilateral relations, even when we didn't disagree, and to understand that that trust can be built upon to reach, if not full agreement, at least a way of understanding why it is we disagree and how we can move ahead, notwithstanding disagreements. And one of the ways to do that, which is funny in a conference which is being broadcast live all over the world, is to stop talking so much in public. And if we are going to talk, let's talk about nice things that we do for each other and the nice things that we think about each other, and hold for our private conversations the issues that divide us. Thank you very much.